Following the death of Jesus around the year 30 CE, his message began to spread through the scattered villages of Judea. Today, we often assume that those who walked with him immediately recorded his life and teachings to preserve them for history. However, while the Apostle Paul would eventually write letters to distant churches in the 50s, his focus remained on theology, not biography. For roughly 40 years, there is no written narrative account detailing the life, miracles, or daily words of the historical Jesus. The Roman Empire was a world defined by a massive educational divide. In ancient Judea, over 90% of the population could neither read nor write. Information didn't travel through books or scrolls, but through the lived reality of these dusty streets and crowded marketplaces. Because of this widespread illiteracy, the early followers of Jesus relied entirely on word-of-mouth transmission. Converts heard stories from travelers and repeated them to their neighbors, ensuring the survival of the movement through speech alone. This reliance on oral tradition meant that for 4 decades, the entire history of the movement was anchored only by the persistence and reliability of human memory. It is easy to assume that ancient oral cultures possessed a heightened, nearly photographic ability to memorize information, that they somehow avoided the mistakes common to written societies. Psychological studies show that human memory is inherently malleable. The brain struggles to distinguish between an authentic recollection and a distorted one, as both appear equally vivid in the mind of the speaker. Over 40 years, the accounts of Jesus' life traveled from person to person and city to city, like a vast game of telephone. The mental recordings of his master's words were relayed thousands of times across the Roman world. As these stories moved through the decades before they were finally committed to ink, they did more than just endure. They began to change. To survive being told and retold, oral narratives often settle into rigid, predictable scripts. Scholars identify this process as form criticism, where a story takes on a specific structure to aid the memory of the narrator. We see this in the Gospel's healing stories. They follow a precise sequence. Someone approaches, Jesus touches them, and the crowd marvels. While this core narrative rhythm remained fixed to prevent the story from being lost, the specific details were often interchangeable. The identity of the sick person or the exact nature of their ailment frequently changed depending on the narrator and the audience. The oral tradition valued the emotional resonance and the theological point of the story over the exact journalistic details of the event. Stories were often reshaped to address the immediate social and religious struggles of the early Christian communities. In the decades following Jesus' death, many believers faced intense criticism from Orthodox Jewish neighbors for their failure to follow strict Sabbath laws. To defend their position, storytellers re-evoked memories of Jesus confronting the Pharisees on the same topic. They presented him delivering a devastating one-liner that effectively settled the debate for their own community. For these believers, the past provided the tools to solve the urgent conflicts of the present. As time passed, certain recollections became physically exaggerated or loaded with immense symbolic weight. One prominent example is the account of Jesus single-handedly driving the money changers from the Jerusalem temple and halting all sacrificial operations. Logistical reality suggests a different scale. The temple complex was vast, roughly the size of 25 modern football fields. It is unlikely that one man could have halted the massive daily sacrificial rituals without being immediately arrested by the guards on site. This pattern of symbolic storytelling continues in the trial of Jesus, specifically the moment Pontius Pilate offers to release the rebel Barabbas to a hostile crowd. Historical records of Pilate, including the rigid Latin engravings on this stone, portray him as a cold and unyielding Roman prefect. There is no historical evidence of any Roman governor releasing a violent insurrectionist simply to appease a local crowd. Translating the name Barabbas from Aramaic offers a different perspective. It literally means son of the Father. This narrative functions as a powerful theological metaphor. It depicts the crowd choosing a violent, false son of the Father over the Savior who was willing to sacrifice himself. Between the years 70 and 100 CE, the oral traditions were finally transcribed by writers living far from the dusty roads of Judea. The linguistic evidence reveals a significant divide between the origins of the movement and its written record. These Gospels are composed in sophisticated, literary Greek, a level of education far beyond the reach of Aramaic-speaking fishermen from Galilee. These texts were penned by anonymous, highly educated Christians living in urban centers across the Greek-speaking world. These authors served as sophisticated editors, compiling and organizing 40 years of evolving oral tradition into the structured narratives we read today. For the first century of their existence, these written accounts circulated among communities without any names attached to them. It wasn't until the late 2nd century that the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were assigned to the manuscripts. This later attribution provided the growing church with the apostolic authority it needed to unify its teachings and distinguish these accounts from other competing gospels. The Gospels reflect a document forged by the hopes, struggles, and shifting memories of thousands of believers across the ancient world. They are the written echoes of an oral movement, living and changing for decades before the first drop of ink hit the page.